The Pacific Ocean in 1942 was a graveyard in the making. Its surface shimmered with light by day and burned red by night, illuminated by tracer fire, flaming oil, and the dying glow of ships that once carried entire nations' hopes. Beneath those waters, unseen but relentless, an invisible war was being fought, a war that would decide the fate of empires. Yet, in those early months after Pearl Harbor, it was a war America was quietly losing. The United States Navy had built one of the most formidable submarine fleets in the world. Diesel-powered steel sharks patrolled the vast Pacific, tasked with choking Japan's lifelines, its merchant convoys, its oil tankers, its troop transports. On paper, these submarines should have devastated the Japanese war machine. In reality, they were cursed. Each time a torpedo left the tube, the crew held their breath. The white wake would streak toward its target, a destroyer, a freighter, sometimes a cruiser, and then nothing. A dull thud, a splash, a mist that defied explanation. "Dud again," whispered a torpedo officer aboard USS Seawolf, slamming his fist into the bulkhead. It became a familiar ritual across the fleet. Aim true, fire, watch failure repeat. It wasn't skill, courage, or opportunity the Americans lacked. It was something far more insidious, a defect buried in the heart of their most important weapon. The Mark 14 torpedo, a supposed marvel of modern engineering, was betraying the very men who depended on it. Unknown to most submarine captains, the Mark 14 had 3 fatal flaws. It ran too deep, its magnetic exploder was unreliable, and its contact detonator often failed to detonate even on a perfect hit. But Washington didn't believe it. The Bureau of Ordnance, the proud gatekeepers of naval weaponry, insisted the problem was with the sailors, not the machine. And so, while American crews risked their lives in the shadowy depths of the Pacific, firing torpedoes that often bounced harmlessly off enemy hulls, Japanese commanders grew complacent. They saw these failed attacks as proof of American inferiority, the arrogance of a nation new to total war. What they didn't know was that beneath the humiliation and frustration, the U.S. Navy was learning, painfully, methodically, relentlessly. In those early months, Japanese naval power seemed unstoppable. The Imperial Navy's long lance torpedoes, the famed Type 93s, streaked across the sea at speeds and ranges the Americans didn't think possible. Powered by pure oxygen instead of compressed air, they left no telltale bubbles. They struck with devastating precision, often from beyond visual range. At the Battle of the Java Sea, entire Allied cruiser squadrons were torn apart by weapons fired from ships the Allies never even saw. While Japan's torpedoes were feared, America's were mocked. The irony was cruel and complete. For nearly 2 years, American submariners would watch their best opportunities vanish, their confidence eroding dive by dive. Imagine the claustrophobic world of a Gato-class submarine. The metal hull creaks under pressure as the boat descends to avoid detection. The air is thick with oil, sweat, and fear. Somewhere above, a Japanese destroyer prowls, dropping depth charges in patient rhythm. Every man aboard has only one hope, that when the moment comes, their torpedo will do what it was built to do. But time and again, it didn't. Commanders sent home after failed missions wrote desperate letters to Fleet Command. Multiple hits observed. No detonations. Enemy ship damaged by explosion of fuel tanks, not torpedo impact. Fired 6. All misses. These were not excuses. They were warnings. Warnings ignored by those too proud to believe their own creation was broken. The most infamous example came in July 1943. The USS Tinosa, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Lawson P. Ramage, found the perfect target, a massive Japanese tanker, Tonin Maru No. 3. Calm seas. Ideal firing conditions. Ramage maneuvered carefully, closing the distance to 1,200 yards. The first torpedo hit. Nothing. A dull thump. No explosion. The second struck dead center. Again, no detonation. He fired all his remaining torpedoes. Out of 15, 12 hit. None exploded. Ramage returned to base, seething with rage. "We had the enemy dead to rights," he wrote. "We could have destroyed him 10 times over." The Tonin Maru limped away. The Bureau of Ordnance dismissed the report. "Faulty aim," they said. "Crew error." Ramage swore that if he ever met those bureaucrats face to face, He'd tell them what it felt like to have their lives depend on a weapon that wouldn't work. Beneath the ocean's surface, frustration turned to fury. Crews began to modify their torpedoes themselves, breaking regulations to prove their suspicions. Some wrapped wires around detonators to force them to explode. Others dove in shallow waters to recover spent torpedoes for analysis. It was dangerous, even suicidal work. But slowly, evidence piled up. The truth, when it emerged, was staggering. The Mark 14 torpedo had been developed in peacetime, never fully tested under real conditions. Its magnetic exploder was calibrated for the North Atlantic, not the warm Pacific. Its depth mechanism was misaligned, causing torpedoes to run 10 to 15 feet deeper than intended, passing harmlessly under enemy hulls. And worst of all, the impact detonator, a fragile crossbar design, often bent on contact instead of triggering an explosion. It was sabotaged by ignorance, a failure of science, of pride, and of bureaucracy. And it had cost lives, many lives. But once the truth could no longer be denied, America's greatest industrial machine roared to life. Naval engineers, working around the clock, began retooling the detonators, recalibrating the depth controls, and rewriting doctrine. By late 1943, the transformation was complete. The torpedo that had been America's greatest embarrassment became its deadliest secret. Meanwhile, the Japanese were still laughing. Their commanders believed the American submarine campaign was an annoyance, not a threat. They dismissed warnings from their own intelligence officers about increasing losses. They believed in the invincibility of their convoys, their destroyer screens, their naval superiority. They had no idea that the weapon that once failed to explode was about to ignite a new kind of war, a war that would turn the Pacific into a graveyard of Japanese steel. The first test of the corrected torpedoes came not in a grand battle, but in a quiet ambush. In the late summer of 1943, a U.S. submarine prowled the waters near the Philippines, tracking a convoy bound for Formosa. When the captain fired his spread, the crew waited, breath held in silence. Then, for the first time, they heard it, the unmistakable roar of a true detonation. One ship gone, then another. Within minutes, a convoy that might once have escaped was torn apart. The word spread like wildfire through the submarine fleet. "They work now," said the message that passed between boats. For the men who had endured humiliation, the tide had turned. By 1944, Japan's nightmare had begun. The dawn of 1944 arrived quietly across the Pacific, but beneath that calm horizon, a silent revolution had begun. For nearly 2 years, American submariners had fought not just the Japanese Navy, but their own weapons. Now, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, they could finally fight back, with confidence, with fury, and with precision. Word spread quickly across the submarine bases at Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, and Brisbane. The new detonators worked. The depth settings were accurate. The Mark 14 torpedo, once a symbol of despair, had been reborn as a weapon of vengeance. Crews who had endured humiliation after humiliation now smiled grimly as they loaded their tubes. "Let's see how they like it now," one torpedo officer muttered aboard USS Cavalla before diving beneath the waves. From the first weeks of the new year, the ocean began to change character. What had once been a highway for Japanese convoys became a killing ground. American submarines fanned out across the shipping lanes between the Philippines, Formosa, and the Japanese home islands. Every night, periscopes broke the surface like silent ghosts. Every morning, another Japanese ship failed to return. At first, Tokyo did not notice. The Imperial Navy's high command was obsessed with the surface war, the great carrier duels, the defense of island fortresses, the desperate push to slow the American advance through the Central Pacific. Submarine warfare seemed unglamorous, secondary, even cowardly. They dismissed reports from merchant captains who described torpedoes appearing from nowhere, ships vanishing without distress signals. But the numbers began to speak louder than pride. In January alone, over 300,000 tons of Japanese shipping were lost. By March, that number had doubled. It was not just warships, but lifelines, oil tankers, food transports, ammunition barges. Japan, an island nation dependent on imports, was slowly being strangled. For the men inside those submarines, the change was more than tactical. It was emotional. They had spent 2 years being haunted by failure, watching perfect shots turn into mockery. Now, every explosion was a vindication. The roar of a torpedo finding its mark wasn't just the sound of victory, it was justice. Commander Sam Dealey of USS Harder became one of the most feared names in the Pacific. Known to his crew as the Destroyer Killer, Dealey stalked Japanese destroyers with a cool precision that bordered on madness. On a single patrol, he sank 5 destroyers in 5 days. His radio message after one attack was as simple as it was chilling: suggest they send more destroyers. The Japanese Navy couldn't understand how the Americans had suddenly become so deadly. Their intelligence officers assumed the U.S. had introduced an entirely new class of torpedoes. They never suspected that it was the same weapon, perfected, corrected, and unleashed. In May 1944, the U.S. submarine Cavalla set out from Pearl Harbor on its first war patrol. Under Commander Herman Kostler, she prowled the Philippine Sea, where the Imperial Navy's carrier fleet was preparing for the coming American invasion of the Marianas. Days passed in silence until, on June 19th, sonar picked up a faint contact, large, fast, and accompanied by destroyers. It was the Shokaku, one of Japan's proudest fleet carriers, survivor of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea. Kostler's crew tracked the carrier through the periscope, watching the massive silhouette slice through the water. The Cavalla maneuvered into firing position. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. 3 torpedoes streaked through the depths. Seconds later, the ocean erupted. The Shokaku shuddered as explosions tore through her hull. Flames raced across her decks. Within minutes, she was gone. The sinking of Shokaku marked more than the loss of a ship. It symbolized the end of Japanese naval invincibility. The same Americans whose torpedoes once bounced off hulls were now sinking aircraft carriers. Word of the disaster spread through Japan like wildfire. The Imperial Navy called it an unfortunate loss due to enemy luck. But luck had nothing to do with it. Back in Pearl Harbor, the submarine command celebrated quietly. They knew what it meant. The war under the sea had turned irreversibly in their favor. As 1944 dragged on, Japan's convoy routes became bloodied corridors. The route from Borneo to Japan, vital for bringing oil, became a death trap. Submarines lay in wait along the narrow straits of the South China Sea, like wolves surrounding a wounded herd. Merchant captains begged for more escorts, more aircraft, more protection. But Japan's resources were dwindling. Destroyers were needed elsewhere. Fuel was scarce. Every convoy lost was another nail in the coffin. For the men aboard American submarines, the missions grew bolder. They surfaced at night to finish crippled ships with deck guns. They rescued downed American pilots from enemy waters. They prowled close to harbors like Ticao and Saigon, firing spreads of torpedoes into the clustered silhouettes of anchored ships. The results were devastating. By the summer of 1944, U.S. submarines were sinking Japanese ships faster than Japan could replace them. By some estimates, over 40% of Japan's merchant tonnage was gone. Factories in Tokyo and Osaka began to slow down. Refineries in Kyushu ran dry. The Imperial Army in Burma and the Philippines found itself cut off from supplies. But the victory came with a cost. Submarine warfare was a lonely, dangerous business. Every patrol could be the last. When a submarine failed to report back, there was rarely a trace. No wreckage, no survivors, just silence. The ocean was both battlefield and graveyard. One such boat was USS Tang, commanded by Richard Dick O'Kane, a daring young officer who had learned under legendary ace Dudley "Mush" Morton aboard the Wahoo. Tang's patrols were legendary. In just 5 missions, O'Kane sank 33 ships. His tactics were audacious, attacking on the surface at night, weaving through enemy escorts, firing point-blank. His crew adored him. The Japanese feared his name. On her final patrol, in October 1944, Tang attacked a heavily guarded convoy near the Formosa Strait. O'Kane fired his last torpedo at a freighter, only to watch in horror as it circled back. A malfunction. The deadly torpedo turned, raced toward its own ship. There was no time to dive. The explosion tore Tang apart. Of her crew of 87, only 9 survived, captured by the Japanese. Even in death, O'Kane's legend endured. His final patrol had sunk over 10 ships, an unmatched feat. Ironically, Tang's loss was a reminder of the old curse, the unpredictable nature of technology in war. Even the fixed Mark 14s could still fail. But the balance had long since shifted. America's submarine force had become a precision instrument of annihilation. By late 1944, the Pacific's undersea war had turned catastrophic for Japan. Merchant captains refused to sail. Naval officers avoided reporting accurate loss figures to Tokyo for fear of punishment. The Imperial Navy's once proud convoys were reduced to pitiful formations. Old trawlers and fishing boats pressed into service as escorts, armed with a single depth-charge rack. They were no match for radar-equipped American submarines that hunted by night and vanished by dawn. In the home islands, the crisis began to show. Rice rationing became severe. Factories shut down due to lack of raw materials. Petroleum reserves dwindled to weeks. For the first time, the Japanese government admitted in internal reports that if the trend continued, the empire would be economically strangled by mid-1945. They were right. Even as Japan's leaders prepared desperate countermeasures, arming merchantmen with guns, forming convoy schools, deploying sonar-equipped corvettes, it was too late. American submarines had learned their craft, improved their technology, and mastered the art of silent killing. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, the submarine arm struck again. USS Darter and Dace, operating in the Palawan Passage, intercepted the Japanese center force. The submarines sent radar reports that changed the course of the entire battle, then attacked. The Otago, flagship of Admiral Takeo Kurita, was torn apart by torpedoes. Maya and Takao followed. The Japanese fleet staggered into the fight, already crippled. It was poetic justice. The weapon that Japan had mocked now played a decisive role in destroying their last hope of victory. By the year's end, the Pacific was no longer the domain of the rising sun. It belonged to the silent hunters, the men of the U.S. submarine force, who made up less than 2% of the Navy's personnel, but were responsible for over half of Japan's maritime losses. They had started the war as failures, cursed by faulty weapons and ignored by bureaucrats. They ended it as legends. And somewhere, deep beneath the waves, the wrecks of tankers, destroyers, and carriers lay together, grim reminders of a truth the Japanese had learned too late. Never underestimate an enemy's ability to learn, adapt, and perfect the art of war. The ocean had changed, and it would never be the same again. By the beginning of 1945, Japan stood at the edge of an abyss it had carved for itself. The empire that once stretched from the jungles of Burma to the beaches of the Aleutians was collapsing under the invisible weight of silence, the silence of ships that no longer returned. For every convoy that set sail, 2 never reached their destination. Every harbor that had once echoed with the clang of loading cranes and the rumble of diesel engines now stood quiet. The empire's lifelines, steel, oil, rice, and men, were bleeding out into the black waters of the Pacific. In Tokyo, the walls of the Naval General Staff Room were covered in red pins marking lost ships. Officers stared in disbelief as the board became a graveyard of their merchant fleet. Reports came in from the south, from Singapore, Borneo, and the Philippines, warning that oil convoys were being hunted down one by one. The Sea of Freedom, as the Japanese had called their empire's highway, had become a corridor of death. And yet, even as the evidence mounted, denial persisted. The Imperial Navy had always viewed submarines as weapons of harassment, not annihilation. Their own undersea fleet had been designed for fleet reconnaissance and attacks on warships, not merchantmen. The Americans, they thought, would fight the same way, honorably, directly, predictably. They were wrong. In the dim light of the combined fleet headquarters, Admiral Somu Toyota listened as intelligence officers described the growing destruction of Japan's merchant marine. The Americans are not fighting as we expected, one officer admitted. They are fighting to suffocate us. Toyota said nothing. The pride of a warrior culture did not easily accept the humiliation of death by starvation. What Japan failed to see, and what America had mastered, was the industrial and technological momentum that turned learning into dominance. When the Mark 14 torpedo's flaws had been exposed in 1943, American engineers didn't hide the failure. They dissected it, studied it, fixed it, and turned it into a weapon that could end an empire. Behind the scenes, in places far from the front lines, in factories in Connecticut, research labs in Newport, and naval yards in Mare Island, a vast, invisible army of workers and scientists waged their own war. They tested detonators thousands of times. They re-engineered guidance fins. They modified explosive charges. Every improvement meant another ship sunk, another convoy destroyed, another thread cut from Japan's web of supply. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese industry was collapsing under its own weight. The steel mills of Kobe and Nagoya, once the beating heart of naval construction, now worked at half capacity. There was no oil for smelters, no rubber for tires, no copper for wiring. Entire factories stood idle, their chimneys cold. The government issued desperate orders to collect scrap metal. Even temple bells and household pots were melted down to feed the war machine that no longer had anything to run on. At sea, the destruction continued relentlessly. American submarines no longer hunted blindly. They had radar, improved sonar, and encrypted intelligence from the brilliant magic codebreakers in Hawaii. Japanese convoy schedules, once thought secure, were now read in advance. Submarines were dispatched to intercept them with mathematical precision. The Japanese response was tragically inadequate. Their anti-submarine tactics lagged years behind the Allies. While the U.S. Navy employed sonar, hedgehog mortars, and coordinated air-sea patrols, Japan relied on outdated depth charges, weak sonar, and untrained crews. Destroyers wasted ammunition firing blindly into empty water. Air patrols flew without radar, searching in futility for periscopes that vanished seconds after surfacing. The few who understood the scope of the disaster were silenced by hierarchy and fear. Captain Hisamitsu Terasaki, a logistics officer who tried to warn the high command, wrote in his private notes, "We are losing this war not from lack of courage, but from lack of listening." His report never reached the emperor. Meanwhile, the Americans pressed harder. Every submarine patrol became more daring, more precise. The USS Barb, commanded by Eugene Lucky Flucky, ventured so close to the Japanese coast that crewmen could see the faint lights of fishing villages on the horizon. In one of the war's most astonishing missions, Flucky and his men went ashore in rubber boats and planted explosives on a coastal train line, the only U.S. ground operation on the Japanese home islands during the war. When the train exploded in the night, the men aboard Barb watched the fireball with grim satisfaction. The message was clear: there was no safe place left in Japan. As winter deepened, the empire's pulse began to falter. The once great merchant fleet of over 6 million tons had shrunk to less than 2 million by early 1945. Tankers that once ferried crude from the East Indies now lay rusting at the bottom of the sea. Coal shipments from Korea stopped. Food rotted on docks in Taiwan because there were no ships left to carry it home. The Japanese called it the transportation crisis. Historians would later call it the silent siege. Inside Japan's cities, the effects were devastating. Trains ran less frequently. Power blackouts became nightly rituals. Factories turned to burning wood because fuel oil was gone. Rice rations fell to starvation levels. Ordinary citizens, who had once been promised a glorious empire of prosperity, now lined up for hours to receive half a bowl of barley mixed with pine bark. The war was eating its own people. And still, the warlords refused to yield. The propaganda ministry produced films glorifying heroic merchantmen who sacrificed themselves for the emperor. They urged sailors to see their deaths not as failure, but as divine duty. Yet behind the slogans, morale collapsed. Merchant captains wept as they set sail, knowing they would never see home again. From the decks of submarines patrolling the Sea of Japan, the Americans could sense it too, the change in the enemy. Ships sailed slower, lower in the water, desperate to conserve fuel. Convoys were smaller, escorts fewer. They were like ghosts, one U.S. submariner recalled. They knew we were out there, and they knew they couldn't stop us. But for all the victories, there was no triumphal joy aboard the submarines, only exhaustion and reflection. Every success came with the knowledge that men were dying unseen beneath the waves. The ocean didn't care about sides. It claimed them all: sailors, merchants, submariners. Even the victors felt the weight of what they had done. In March 1945, Japan's last major oil convoy was destroyed off the coast of Indochina by USS Cavalla and USS Trigger. The flames burned for hours, visible from over the horizon. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left to salvage. Without oil, Japan's remaining warships were trapped in port, their hulls gathering dust. The mighty battleship Yamato, symbol of Japan's pride, sat immobile in Kure Bay, a floating monument to a dying empire. Back in Washington, Admiral Charles Lockwood, the commander of the U.S. submarine fleet in the Pacific, received the reports. His men had achieved what no air raid or amphibious invasion could accomplish: the complete isolation of an empire. "We have turned Japan into an island in every sense," he wrote. For the Japanese, it was a nightmare of their own design, an empire built on the sea, destroyed by it. And yet, even in the face of collapse, there were moments of astonishing bravery. Convoy escorts that knew they were doomed still fought back, charging sonar contacts, dropping their last depth charges into the blackness, determined to take at least one American submarine with them. Some did. The USS Trigger, one of the Navy's most successful boats, was lost during one of these desperate encounters in March 1945. Her final transmission ended simply: going deep. She never came back. By April, the American submarines no longer hunted convoys. There were none left. Instead, they prowled near Japan's shores, attacking anything that moved: fishing boats, barges, ferries. It was a cruel necessity, a final act to ensure the enemy could no longer feed itself or move troops. The war had become total, the ocean itself an instrument of siege. From Tokyo's bomb shelters, government officials listened to the distant thunder of American bombers overhead and wondered how it had come to this. Their fleets were gone. Their cities were burning. And beneath the waves, an unseen enemy had already won the war of endurance. The same ocean that had once brought Japan wealth, conquest, and glory now delivered only silence, the silence of defeat. The empire built on steel had turned to sand. Inside Japan's cities, the effects were devastating. Trains ran less frequently. Power blackouts became nightly rituals. Factories turned to burning wood because fuel oil was gone. Rice rations fell to starvation levels. Ordinary citizens, who had once been promised a glorious empire of prosperity, now lined up for hours to receive half a bowl of barley mixed with pine bark. The war was eating its own people. And still, the warlords refused to yield. The propaganda ministry produced films glorifying heroic merchantmen who sacrificed themselves for the emperor. They urged sailors to see their deaths not as failure, but as divine duty. Yet behind the slogans, morale collapsed. Merchant captains wept as they set sail, knowing they would never see home again. From the decks of submarines patrolling the Sea of Japan, the Americans could sense it too: the change in the enemy. Ships sailed slower, lower in the water, desperate to conserve fuel. Convoys were smaller, escorts fewer. They were like ghosts, one U.S. submariner recalled. They knew we were out there, and they knew they couldn't stop us. But for all the victories, there was no triumphal joy aboard the submarines. Only exhaustion and reflection. Every success came with the knowledge that men were dying unseen beneath the waves. The ocean didn't care about sides. It claimed them all: sailors, merchants, submariners. Even the victors felt the weight of what they had done. In March 1945, Japan's last major oil convoy was destroyed off the coast of Indochina by USS Cavalla and USS Trigger. The flames burned for hours, visible from over the horizon. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left to salvage. Without oil, Japan's remaining warships were trapped in port, their hulls gathering dust. The mighty battleship Yamato, symbol of Japan's pride, sat immobile in Kure Bay, a floating monument to a dying empire. Back in Washington, Admiral Charles Lockwood, the commander of the U.S. submarine fleet in the Pacific, received the reports. His men had achieved what no air raid or amphibious invasion could accomplish: the complete isolation of an empire. "We have turned Japan into an island in every sense," he wrote. For the Japanese, it was a nightmare of their own design, an empire built on the sea, destroyed by it. And yet, even in the face of collapse, there were moments of astonishing bravery. Convoy escorts that knew they were doomed still fought back, charging sonar contacts, dropping their last depth charges into the blackness, determined to take at least one American submarine with them. Some did. The USS Trigger, one of the Navy's most successful boats, was lost during one of these desperate encounters in March 1945. Her final transmission ended simply: going deep. She never came back. By April, the American submarines no longer hunted convoys. There were none left. Instead, they prowled near Japan's shores, attacking anything that moved: fishing boats, barges, ferries. It was a cruel necessity, a final act to ensure the enemy could no longer feed itself or move troops. The war had become total, the ocean itself an instrument of siege. From Tokyo's bomb shelters, government officials listened to the distant thunder of American bombers overhead and wondered how it had come to this. Their fleets were gone. Their cities were burning. And beneath the waves, an unseen enemy had already won the war of endurance. The same ocean that had once brought Japan wealth, conquest, and glory now delivered only silence, the silence of defeat. The empire built on steel had turned to sand. By the spring of 1945, Japan's empire was little more than a shadow cast over a dying sea. The map still showed red lines stretching across the Pacific, but those lines no longer connected anything. The shipping routes that once pulsed with life, oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, iron from Manchuria, had vanished beneath the waves. The once invincible merchant fleet, which had carried the lifeblood of the empire, was now a graveyard scattered across the ocean floor. The submarines of the United States Navy had achieved something that no weapon in human history had ever done. They had strangled an empire from beneath the surface of the earth. No parades, no banners, no grand speeches. Just silence, and the slow, relentless disappearance of ships. At the heart of this campaign was not hatred, but purpose. The men who manned those submarines, steel tubes barely 300 feet long, lived in darkness and fear, hunted as much as they hunted. For them, the war was not fought for glory, but for endurance. In those claustrophobic corridors, where sweat mixed with diesel and the air grew thick with carbon dioxide, they listened for the faint hum of enemy propellers, knowing that one wrong sound could mean death. Every time they surfaced at night to recharge their batteries, the vastness of the Pacific reminded them how small they were. Stars stretched endlessly above, the sea black and bottomless below. In those moments, they felt the weight of the war pressing down, a war fought not in headlines or heroism, but in unseen sacrifices. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the truth could no longer be denied. Reports flooded in daily. No ships left to move coal from Korea, no oil to fuel the navy, no rice to feed the cities. Whole provinces in Japan were starving. The once proud naval staff, who had boasted that Japan could fight for 100 years, now whispered in fear that they might not survive the next 100 days. The Imperial Navy's Chief of Staff, Admiral Toyota, convened what would become one of the most desperate meetings in naval history. He asked his officers a question that no one dared answer. If the Americans invade, how do we stop them when our ships cannot sail and our planes cannot fly? The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, the admirals of the Empire of Japan understood that their war machine, built on honor, courage, and obedience, had been defeated not by a single battle, but by numbers, steel, and logic. The Americans had turned the ocean into a weapon. At sea, the submarine USS Tang had already achieved legendary status. Commanded by Richard "Dick" O'Kane, she had sunk more tonnage than any other U.S. submarine. O'Kane's daring tactics, attacking convoys on the surface at night, weaving through destroyer screens at point-blank range, rewrote the rulebook of undersea warfare. But even heroes could fall. In October 1944, during an attack on a Japanese convoy, one of Tang's own torpedoes malfunctioned, circled back, and struck the submarine. The explosion killed most of the crew instantly. Only 9 men survived, captured and imprisoned by the Japanese. Their ordeal mirrored the cruelty of the war itself. Victory and tragedy intertwined, innovation and error inseparable. While Tang's wreck lay silent on the ocean floor, her legacy lived on. Every submarine that followed carried improved weapons, smarter tactics, and deeper resolve. By 1945, the Mark 18 electric torpedo, quiet, reliable, and deadly, had replaced the flawed Mark 14s of the war's early years. The Americans no longer fired in hope, they fired with certainty. Every torpedo launched was an execution of the Empire's remaining arteries. Tankers, freighters, troop transports, all fell victim to a war fought by men who never saw their enemies face to face. From the decks of ships like the USS Barb, USS Harder, and USS Cavalla, American crews watched explosions bloom across the sea, ships erupting into pillars of fire, cargo igniting like pyres. They could hear the screams carried by the wind, the distant crack of splitting steel. And yet, they knew that every ship destroyed was one less that could carry soldiers, oil, or ammunition to prolong the war. War at sea had become both mechanical and moral. In one harrowing patrol report, a submarine commander wrote, "We sank a convoy of 3 oil tankers today. The fires burned for 9 hours. I thought of the men aboard, and I thought of the men who died at Pearl Harbor. I do not rejoice, but I do not regret." It was the brutal arithmetic of survival. In Japan, the effects rippled through every corner of society. Fishermen could no longer find fuel for their boats. Hospitals lacked medical supplies. Farmers couldn't transport their crops. Even the Imperial Palace rationed electricity. By July 1945, Tokyo was a city of darkness, blackouts, hunger, and whispers of defeat. And still, the government ordered civilians to prepare for 100 million glorious deaths in the defense of the homeland. Pamphlets instructed families to make bamboo spears. Schoolchildren were taught to fight tanks with grenades. The absurdity of it all only deepened the despair. Admiral Toyota, the same man who had once commanded fleets that stretched across oceans, now signed orders for ships that didn't exist. "There is no navy," one aide wrote in his diary. "Only ghosts of ships and the memory of courage." The American submarines continued their relentless patrols, moving closer to the Japanese coast. They could see the lights of villages, smell the smoke of burning cities, hear distant air raid sirens carried across the water. The war was entering its final, merciless stage. In the small hours of the night, the crew of USS Archerfish spotted an enormous silhouette on the horizon, a Japanese battleship moving slowly, unescorted. It was the Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built, converted from the hull of a battleship and rushed into service. She had never even been fully fitted out. The Americans closed in, unseen beneath the waves. At 3:17 a.m., they fired 6 torpedoes. Struck home. The Shinano sank within 7 hours, taking more than 1,400 men with her. She had been at sea for just 16 hours. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Japan's final naval hope, destroyed before it ever had a chance to fight. The U.S. submarine campaign had become an invisible hammer, striking relentlessly until there was nothing left to hit. In the closing months of the war, American submarines operated freely off Japan's coastlines, surfacing in daylight, taking photographs, even rescuing downed Allied pilots from the water. The empire that had once dominated the Pacific now hid behind its shrinking shores. The final blow came not from the submarines, but from the skies, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the mushroom clouds that ended the war in a single breath. Yet even then, beneath the surface, the submariners continued their watch, waiting for the word that would finally allow them to exhale. When the order came, "Cease all offensive operations," some crews wept openly. Others sat in silence. After years of living in darkness, hunting shadows, the sudden peace felt unreal. They had won a war that few understood, in a world that would never see what they had done. And so, when Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, it did so not only because of the bombs that fell from the sky, but because of the unseen war beneath the sea, the war that broke its back, starved its factories, and silenced its fleets. For every burning ship, every lost convoy, and every man swallowed by the Pacific, there was a truth that echoed through history. Empires do not fall in a single day. They erode, one torpedo, one explosion, one decision at a time. The men of the submarine fleet had fought in darkness so that the world could emerge into light. And though their war ended in silence, that silence was victory. When the guns fell silent in September 1945, the Pacific did not. The sea remained restless, as if unwilling to forget what it had witnessed. Beneath its surface lay tens of thousands of wrecks, from mighty carriers to nameless transport ships, each a steel tomb holding the ghosts of an empire's ambition. The Japanese surrender was not just a military defeat, it was the unraveling of a national illusion. For years, the empire had believed in its divine invincibility, that spirit could overcome machinery, that courage could defeat steel. But the Pacific had no respect for ideology. It answered only to physics, industry, and endurance. In Tokyo, amid the ruins, men in faded uniforms burned documents, hid insignias, and waited for occupation forces. For many naval officers, the shame was unbearable. Admiral Toyota, the man who had once commanded the world's third-largest navy, now lived in quiet exile, haunted by what he called the silence of the sea. He wrote in his final diary entry before his death in 1957, "We built ships for glory. They became graves. We believed in honor. It became folly. We fought to preserve our nation, and in doing so, destroyed it." Across the ocean, in Pearl Harbor, the submariners returned to a world that barely understood what they had done. There were no ticker-tape parades for them, no grand speeches. They came back gaunt, pale, and blinking into the sunlight. Men who had lived for years in steel coffins. Their victory had been absolute, but invisible. The U.S. submarine service had comprised just 2% of the Navy's personnel, yet it had sunk over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping, more than half of Japan's maritime losses. It was a war of statistics, but behind each number was a story, a decision made in seconds, a torpedo fired into darkness, a life taken without ever seeing the enemy's face. Many of the men carried that weight with them forever. Commander Edward Beach, who had served aboard the USS Trigger, once said, "You could not help but feel pity for them. You'd see a ship burning on the horizon, and you knew that men, young men, like yourself, were dying. But pity had no place underwater. Pity could get you killed." The submariners had become masters of paradox, killers who mourned, heroes who hid, victors who could not celebrate. In the post-war years, as America's cities roared back to life, many veterans found the silence unbearable. Some couldn't sleep without the hum of diesel engines. Others kept small mementos, a compass, a depth gauge, a patch of deck steel, reminders of the dark world beneath the waves where they had become something between men and machines. In museums, the old submarines were turned into exhibits. Children climbed through their narrow passages, laughing, unaware that men had once lived and died in those same cramped spaces. For the veterans who visited, the smell of oil and iron brought everything back in an instant. One crewman, standing inside the restored USS Pampanito decades later, whispered to his grandson, "It was darker than you can imagine, louder than thunder, and lonelier than death." For Japan, the legacy of its naval defeat was equally complex. The nation that had once dominated the Pacific became one of peace and reconstruction. The surviving sailors, those few who had lived through torpedo attacks, lifeboat drifts, or years in prisoner-of-war camps, spoke rarely of what they had seen. Many were haunted by the same memory, the sight of their shipmates disappearing beneath the sea, hands reaching up through the foam. When interviewed years later, a former Japanese destroyer officer recalled the helplessness of hunting submarines that could not be seen. They were ghosts. We dropped depth charges, but they were never there. Only the sea would rise, and then go still again. We were not fighting men. We were fighting silence. In that silence, the lessons of the Pacific War began to take shape. American engineers dissected the torpedo failures that had once crippled the fleet. They discovered that bureaucratic arrogance, not science, had nearly cost them the war's most strategic advantage. It had taken field commanders, stubborn enough to challenge official dogma, to expose the truth. The Mark 14 torpedo had failed because those in charge refused to admit error. The magnetic exploders were never properly tested. The depth settings were based on flawed mathematics. And yet, for almost 2 years, the Bureau of Ordnance insisted the torpedoes were perfect, while submarine crews risked their lives firing duds. The scandal became a case study in wartime accountability. It wasn't just about weapons. It was about the courage to question authority. The silent war beneath the waves had been fought not only against the Japanese, but against complacency within the American system itself. When the Mark 18 and Mark 27 torpedoes entered service, built on lessons learned through blood, they represented more than technological progress. They were proof that truth, once confronted, could win wars. Japan had learned a similar lesson in reverse. The Imperial Navy's obsession with the long lance torpedo, a technological marvel that had terrified Allied sailors early in the war, had blinded them to the realities of submarine warfare. They had built a weapon for decisive battles, but ignored the slow strangulation of logistics. When the merchant ships sank, so too did the Empire. By 1945, even Japan's submarines were used as cargo haulers, ferrying food and ammunition between dying island garrisons. The proud doctrine of decisive surface engagement had been rendered obsolete by a new kind of warfare, one that valued persistence over pride and patience over power. In the aftermath, historians would call it the Invisible Campaign. It had no flag-raising moment, no single victory day, but its effects were more profound than any battle fought above the surface. The United States learned that technology alone was not enough. It needed testing, skepticism, and truth. Japan learned that courage and belief could not substitute for industry and science. Both nations emerged changed forever. And yet, beneath the ocean, the wrecks still whisper their own truth. Divers who descend into those silent steel tombs, the skeletal remains of tankers, destroyers, and submarines, describe an eerie peace. Coral grows where men once stood at battle stations. Fish swim through corridors where officers once shouted commands. Nature, in its quiet indifference, has reclaimed the machinery of destruction. Each rusting hull is a story of fear, duty, and the thin line between triumph and tragedy. In 1960, a Japanese journalist visited the wreck of the Shokaku, one of the aircraft carriers sunk by American submarines. When asked what he felt, he replied, "It is not anger. It is not sorrow. It is the knowledge that we all sank together, Americans and Japanese, into the same ocean of madness." Today, the story of the Pacific submarine campaign stands as both a triumph of ingenuity and a warning of arrogance. The war beneath the waves was a human drama written in silence, where courage met conscience, and the sea kept every secret. For those who survived, the memories never surfaced completely. They lived the rest of their lives with the hum of the engines in their ears, the smell of oil in their lungs, and the knowledge that the world they fought to save would never truly understand the world they fought within. The sea remembers, in the slow rust of steel, in the drifting silt that settles over the bones of sailors, in the haunting quiet that still hangs over the deep Pacific. It is said that if you listen long enough, you can still hear it. The faint echo of engines, the soft thud of torpedoes, the whispered words of men who once commanded the depths. And somewhere out there, beneath miles of water, the ghosts of both fleets remain, American and Japanese, hunter and hunted, resting side by side in the eternal blue silence that ended a war. The Pacific War had ended, but the silence it left behind was deceptive. Beneath the calm waves, a new kind of war was already beginning, one colder, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous. The lessons learned from torpedo failures, sonar hunts, and submerged duels would not die with 1945. They became the blueprint for a new age of invisible conflict, the era of the nuclear submarine. When the smoke of Hiroshima and Nagasaki faded, the world entered a period of uneasy peace. But peace, in the mid-20th century, meant preparation for annihilation. The oceans, once the battlefield of iron and diesel, became the secret domain of atomic monsters. For the men who had fought in the Pacific, the transformation was almost unrecognizable. In 1946, the U.S. Navy conducted Operation Crossroads, a series of nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll. Old warships, many of them veterans of the Pacific battles, were lined up like ghosts to face a new weapon, the atomic bomb. When the mushroom cloud rose above the lagoon, it wasn't just ships that sank. It was the entire era of conventional naval warfare. What had taken submarines years to achieve, the slow strangulation of enemy shipping, could now be accomplished in minutes with a single bomb. But within that destruction lay revelation. The submarines, once hunters of steel, could now become the carriers of apocalypse. In 1954, the USS Nautilus was launched, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. Unlike the diesel-electric boats of World War II, which needed to surface for air, the Nautilus could remain submerged indefinitely. It was the culmination of every hard lesson learned in the Pacific: stealth, endurance, and survivability. The submariners who had once fought in the cramped, oil-slicked conditions of boats like the Wahoo or Tang could hardly believe it. The Nautilus was spacious, clean, and deadly. It could dive deeper, move faster, and stay hidden longer than anything imagined during the war. But the psychological core of submarine warfare hadn't changed. The silence, the pressure, the claustrophobia, those remained eternal. The ocean still demanded the same price: isolation and endurance. Only now, the stakes were far higher. A single launch order could end civilization. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Soviet Union, rebuilt and embittered by the war, was racing to catch up. In 1957, as Sputnik orbited overhead, Soviet engineers were building their own answer to the Nautilus, the K-3 Leninsky Komsomol, their first nuclear submarine. And so, the great rivalry that had once existed between the U.S. and Imperial Japan now shifted into an ideological and technological duel between East and West. The same oceans that had once echoed with depth charges now became the silent highways of deterrence. Submarines no longer hunted convoys, they hunted cities. By the 1960s, both powers had perfected the concept of second strike capability, the idea that even if one nation was destroyed in a nuclear attack, its submarines, hidden deep beneath the waves, could still retaliate. It was a balance built on fear. And in that fear, the ghosts of World War II still lingered. Many of the early Cold War submarine commanders had served in the Second World War. Their instincts, forged in the fires of Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippine Sea, shaped how they thought about survival and strategy. They carried with them the same lessons that had turned the tide of the Pacific. Never underestimate your enemy's innovation. Test every weapon as if your life depends on it. And above all, silence is survival. These principles, born in the age of torpedoes, became the doctrine of the nuclear navy. In the U.S., Admiral Hyman Rickover, the father of the nuclear submarine program, famously declared, "Good ideas are not adopted automatically. They must be driven into practice with courageous impatience." Rickover was as relentless as the old World War II submarine captains, a man who demanded perfection, knowing that one mistake at depth could mean annihilation. His philosophy was a continuation of the same fight against bureaucratic arrogance that had crippled the Mark 14 torpedo program. He believed that safety and truth were non-negotiable. While the Cold War submarines prowled silently, their crews lived lives eerily similar to their World War II predecessors, enclosed in steel, surrounded by darkness, operating under unrelenting psychological pressure. One sailor aboard a ballistic missile submarine in the 1970s wrote in his diary, "It feels like living in a time machine. We dive, we vanish, and when we return to the surface, months have passed. The world could have ended, and we wouldn't even know." It was a haunting echo of what World War II veterans had said decades earlier, that beneath the sea, time ceases to exist. There is only routine, machinery, and the endless hum of life support systems. The difference now was the magnitude of destruction at their fingertips. Each missile aboard an Ohio-class submarine carried more destructive power than all the bombs dropped in World War II combined. And yet, paradoxically, the presence of these submarines was what prevented war. The silence that had once killed now preserved peace. But the Cold War wasn't just about deterrence. It was also a hidden continuation of the technological race that began in World War II, a race of sensors, sonar, torpedoes, and stealth. The Americans developed passive sonar arrays capable of listening to the faintest propeller noise hundreds of miles away. The Soviets countered with titanium-hulled subs like the K-278 Komsomolets, capable of diving beyond 3,000 feet, deeper than any Western submarine could go. Every innovation mirrored an old lesson from the Pacific. The U.S. had learned to perfect engineering through testing and feedback. The Soviets learned to innovate through necessity and desperation, the same way Japan once had. Each side hunted the other's shadows in a game of cat and mouse that spanned decades. The ocean became a chessboard of ghosts, unseen players maneuvering in silence, each hoping the other would never make a fatal move. And yet, through all the technological evolution, one truth remained unchanged. The ocean was still the ultimate enemy. Pressure, darkness, isolation. No matter how advanced the submarine, the ocean always reminded humanity of its fragility. In 1963, the USS Thresher, one of the most advanced nuclear submarines of its time, was lost during a test dive. 129 men perished instantly. The cause? A simple mechanical failure, a broken pipe joint, a malfunctioning valve. It was a brutal reminder that in the sea, even perfection can drown. The loss of the Thresher led to the creation of the SubSafe program, a rigorous safety system that remains in place to this day. Just as World War II had forced hard lessons about testing torpedoes, the Thresher taught a new generation the same truth. Technology must always be humbled before nature. Meanwhile, in Japan, a nation reborn in peace, the ghosts of its wartime navy faded into memory. The once feared Imperial fleet was gone, replaced by the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, a force designed not for conquest, but for preservation. The Japanese built some of the world's most advanced diesel-electric submarines, quiet, efficient, and defensive. Ironically, the very nation that had once unleashed the long-lance torpedo now became a master of anti-submarine warfare. It was history's way of balancing the scales. By the late 20th century, the silent duel beneath the oceans had evolved beyond even the dreams of 1940s engineers. Nuclear subs could stay submerged for months, circling the globe unseen. Satellite tracking, deep-sea cables, and sonar networks connected the entire planet in a web of listening and silence. And yet, for all its sophistication, the emotional core of submarine warfare, that strange mixture of courage and fear, isolation and pride, remained timeless. A veteran of the USS Ohio once said, "Every time we dive, I think about those men in World War II, the ones who fired torpedoes that didn't work, who went down with their boats. We carry their ghosts with us. They taught us what silence costs." In the cold depths of the world's oceans, history doesn't fade, it echoes. The Pacific still holds the bones of ships from both sides, silent reminders of what happens when nations stop listening to truth. The war that began with defective torpedoes and arrogance ended in an era of flawless precision and controlled fear. The ocean keeps secrets better than any human archive. Beneath the still waters of the Pacific, the echoes of the Second World War still move, slow, silent, and eternal. The rusting hulls of once mighty submarines and destroyers sleep in darkness, untouched by sunlight, their stories entombed in salt and steel. But for those who lived through that era, who felt the metal groan, the pressure tighten, and the sea close in, the memories never stayed buried. The story of America's torpedo revolution, of arrogance, failure, and eventual triumph, did more than win a war. It created a generation of men who came to understand that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, was worth more than medals or myths. And in that truth lay the foundation for a new kind of warfare, not built on pride, but on precision, accountability, and science. In the late 1940s, as peace settled uneasily across the world, a few surviving submarine captains were invited to teach at the U.S. Navy's newly established submarine school in New London, Connecticut. Among them was Commander Charles Swede Mommsen, the brilliant engineer and innovator who had saved countless submariners through his invention of the Mommsen lung, an emergency breathing device. Mommsen, who had spent much of the war fighting bureaucratic resistance just to improve life-saving equipment, told his students something profound. Steel doesn't forgive arrogance. The ocean doesn't care about your rank. His words became doctrine. Every new generation of submariners, every engineer designing the next weapon, was taught to respect the unforgiving precision demanded by the sea. That philosophy, born from the tragedy of the Mark XIV torpedo and the heroism of men like Dudley Mush Morton and Dick O'Kane, became the quiet moral compass of the post-war Navy. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan's surviving naval officers were going through their own reckoning. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, often called the father of the kamikaze, took his own life in the final days of the war, haunted by the loss of so many pilots. Others, like Admiral Mato Magaki, died in one last, futile mission. But among the submarine officers, those who had once relied on the unstoppable Type 93 long-lance torpedo, there was a grim awareness that Japan's technological superiority had not been enough. They had won the early battles, but lost the war of endurance. The Imperial Navy had built the fastest, deepest diving submarines in the world, yet they lacked sonar coordination, air cover, and logistical foresight. They had underestimated the enemy's industrial might. In a 1946 interview, one captured Japanese naval engineer said bitterly, "We thought courage could replace oil. We thought honor could replace logistics. We were wrong." His words would echo through generations of historians trying to understand how a nation so advanced in naval design could fall so swiftly once the tide turned. By 1950, as the Cold War began reshaping the world, both America and Japan, now uneasy allies, faced a new kind of naval challenge: memory. The wrecks of the war still littered the ocean floor. Families of missing sailors still waited for closure. And deep-sea expeditions began in earnest, not just to chart geography, but to find ghosts. American oceanographers, using sonar mapping technology derived from wartime research, began discovering lost submarines across the Pacific. The USS Wahoo, commanded by Mush Morton, was located decades later, resting silently beneath 200 feet of water off La Perouse Strait, a steel coffin holding 79 souls. The find was bittersweet. For historians, it was a confirmation of heroism. For families, it was closure. But for the Navy, it was a reminder. Every improvement, every hard-earned lesson, had been paid for in blood. In the 1960s and 70s, as new generations of submariners joined the fleet, many visited museums like Battleship Cove, Pearl Harbor's Beaufort Park, or Groton's Submarine Force Museum. There, they stood before the old Mark 14 torpedoes, gleaming under display lights, polished to perfection. Few visitors realized the irony. These beautiful machines had once been the Navy's greatest failure. Next to them sat the Mark 18 electric torpedo, the weapon that finally turned the tide, silent, reliable, and deadly. A placard beneath it read simply, "Introduced in 1943, used effectively to end the Pacific War." But the real story wasn't written on brass plates or museum walls. It lived in the minds of those who survived the old boats, the diesel engines, the smell of sweat and oil, the click of valves, and the eternal hum of the sea. When interviewed for an oral history project, veteran torpedo man Jack Farrell recalled, "People ask what courage looked like in a sub. It wasn't shouting or heroics. It was holding your breath, counting the seconds after a torpedo launch, praying it would hit. And when it didn't, loading another and doing it all over again." That perseverance, that refusal to surrender even when betrayed by your own weapons, became the spiritual core of the U.S. submarine service. As the decades passed, historians began re-examining the torpedo scandal with a more nuanced eye. It wasn't just a story of incompetence. It was a story about the human condition, pride, bureaucracy, and the cost of ignoring truth. The Bureau of Ordnance, once defensive and dismissive, became a cautionary tale in military academies. Officers studying procurement and engineering failures would read case studies about how the Mark 14 debacle delayed victory in the Pacific by nearly 2 years. Yet, paradoxically, those same failures accelerated technological progress afterward. By the Korean War and into Vietnam, the United States had the most advanced torpedoes in the world, guided, acoustic, and self-correcting. Every new model was tested ruthlessly, every flaw documented openly. The ghosts of World War II had demanded nothing less. The irony of history is that the Japanese Type 93 Long Lance, the weapon that once terrorized Allied sailors, became the inspiration for modern torpedo development. Its use of oxygen-based propulsion and high-range influenced post-war Western designs for decades. In a twist of fate, Japanese and American engineers would later collaborate on submarine propulsion systems, sonar technology, and torpedo design. The two nations that had once tried to annihilate each other beneath the waves now shared research to protect the same oceans. It was one of the quietest, most profound transformations in modern military history, a symbol of how understanding, once born from destruction, could lead to progress. Still, the ocean remembers. Every year, divers exploring the Pacific trenches encounter remnants of that silent war. Unexploded torpedoes half buried in silt, their brass casings gleaming faintly in the dim light. They are relics of a time when the world's fate was decided by men operating in complete darkness, trusting machines that didn't always deserve that trust. Marine biologists often note how coral and marine life now grow over these weapons, how nature has reclaimed instruments of death and turned them into habitats. It's as if the sea itself is healing from the wounds of human arrogance. And somewhere, deep beneath the waves, the submarines still rest. The Wahoo, the Tang, the Grayback, the Runner, silent steel tombs filled with unanswered prayers. They are reminders that progress is built not only on success, but on failure. That every modern weapon, every doctrine, every new invention owes its existence to those who didn't live long enough to see it perfected. In the modern era, as unmanned submarines and AI-controlled drones begin to explore the deep, a strange parallel emerges. Just as in 1942, technology is racing ahead of understanding. Machines are growing more autonomous, decision-making more detached, and war more abstract. But beneath all the digital precision, the lessons of World War II remain hauntingly relevant. Test everything. Question authority. Respect the sea. Because the moment we stop doing those things, history will find a way to repeat itself, whether through mechanical failure, overconfidence, or simple human neglect. The ocean is patient. It waits for mistakes, and it never forgets. When the Pacific War ended in August 1945, the oceans went silent again, but the silence was deceptive. Beneath that calm surface, the lessons learned from torpedo failures, engineering arrogance, and intelligence blindness had forever reshaped the way nations prepared for war. The Mark 14 torpedo, once the shame of the U.S. Navy, became a case study in every military academy around the world. Its story was more than a tale of faulty weapons. It was a mirror showing what happens when pride blinds judgment, when bureaucracy silences truth, and when engineers are ignored by commanders. Out of that failure was born a new creed, a quiet, powerful principle that still guides naval warfare today. Every error must speak. That creed changed everything, from how weapons are tested, to how intelligence is shared, to how nations train those who go to sea. The post-war reckoning. In 1946, a Navy investigative board finally released a detailed report on the Mark 14 torpedo fiasco. It was not widely publicized at the time, but within the Navy, it caused a seismic shift. The findings were blunt. Depth-keeping mechanisms had been miscalibrated due to testing in freshwater, not seawater. Magnetic exploders had been designed without proper field testing, making them unstable near the equator. Contact detonators failed when striking at oblique angles, something real combat conditions made inevitable. The board's final conclusion read, "Responsibility for these failures lies not in technology, but in the failure to question technology." For young officers reading that line, it was like scripture. The age of blind trust in authority was over. From that moment onward, the Navy instituted a rigorous new system of field testing and independent verification. Every new weapon, from torpedoes to sonar arrays, had to prove itself not just in laboratories, but in real ocean conditions, under pressure, depth, and heat. The spirit of men like Commander Charles Lockwood, who had fought the bureaucracy to uncover the truth, became institutionalized. Test depth no longer meant just how deep a submarine could dive. It meant how deep the Navy would dig to find the truth. The rise of precision. The immediate post-war years saw the introduction of a new generation of torpedoes, the Mark 18, the Mark 27 Cutie, and eventually the Mark 37, the first fully guided torpedo. Where the Mark 14 had relied on gyros, mechanical timers, and guesswork, these new weapons could track targets acoustically, homing in on the noise of a ship's propellers. They were silent, electric, and deadly. By the 1950s, torpedo design had merged with early computer science. Engineers who once worked with slide rules now programmed analog computers that could calculate course corrections in milliseconds. And through it all, the lessons of World War II haunted the design rooms. Every new weapon was tested mercilessly. Every design flaw was treated as a potential death sentence. The phrase Mark 14 became shorthand for what not to repeat. Japan's transformation. While America's submarine force evolved into a precision instrument of deterrence, Japan faced a more existential question. How does a nation that once glorified naval supremacy live without a navy? Under the terms of its post-war constitution, Japan was forbidden from maintaining offensive weapons. Its once proud Imperial Navy was dismantled. But as the Cold War deepened, new realities emerged. In 1954, Japan established the Maritime Self-Defense Force, JMSDF, a modest, defense-oriented navy focused on anti-submarine warfare. Ironically, the very country that had once unleashed the fearsome long-lance torpedo now trained to defend against submarine attacks. Many of the JMSDF's early officers were veterans of the old Imperial Navy. They carried the same discipline and precision that had defined Japan's wartime fleet, but now tempered by humility. A former Japanese submarine commander once told an American visitor in the 1960s, "We once fought the ocean. Now we serve it." It was not poetry. It was atonement. In time, Japan became one of the world's leaders in submarine technology once again, but this time as an ally of the United States. The two nations shared sonar research, propulsion designs, and torpedo guidance systems, a collaboration unthinkable just 20 years earlier. Cold War depths. The legacy of WWII submarine lessons reached its technological peak during the Cold War. The oceans became the front lines of a silent, invisible war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Submarines grew larger, faster, and deadlier, nuclear-powered leviathans capable of staying submerged for months. Torpedoes evolved into guided missiles of terrifying precision, with onboard computers and wire guidance. But in the control rooms of these new machines, sailors still whispered old stories of dud torpedoes, of commanders who defied orders to fix what was broken, of submarines that never came back. The spirit of the World War II submarine men, skeptical, methodical, and fiercely independent, lived on. The U.S. Navy Submarine School at Groton continued to teach the story of the Mark 14 as a core lesson in ethics and engineering. Every trainee learned not only how to operate a submarine, but how to question what they were told. Instructors called it the Lockwood Principle. If the weapon doesn't work, fix it. If the command won't listen, prove it. That principle saved lives, not just in wartime, but in the constant, tense patrols of the Cold War, when a single error could have started World War III. Rediscovery and memory. By the 1980s and 1990s, the story of America's torpedo crisis was no longer a military secret. It was history. Books, documentaries, and declassified reports began to appear, shedding light on one of the most embarrassing and consequential technical failures in naval history. But far from being shameful, the story fascinated readers. It showed how complex systems, military, industrial, political, could fail catastrophically when communication breaks down. One historian wrote, "The Mark 14 was a torpedo that missed its target but hit the soul of the Navy." At the same time, divers and historians began locating the long-lost submarines of World War II. Wahoo, Tang, Grayback, Grunion, and others. Each discovery brought both closure and reverence. When the wreck of the USS Tang was finally confirmed off the coast of China, it reignited public interest in the incredible story of its captain, Richard O'Kane, who had survived the submarine's final explosion and later received the Medal of Honor. O'Kane's memoir, Clear the Bridge, became a Bible for naval historians, a first-hand chronicle of courage, leadership, and the maddening struggle against defective weapons. Lessons that outlived the war. As modern navies entered the 21st century, the ghosts of the old torpedo war continued to whisper warnings. Every failed test, every software glitch, every questionable design choice was now analyzed through the lens of what happened last time. Engineers spoke of the Mark 14 effect, the danger of assuming success without verification. In 2008, when a batch of modern torpedoes failed during trials due to sensor errors, naval investigators invoked World War II directly in their report. We are not the first generation to learn this lesson. Let us not be the one to forget it. The same principle echoed across other industries: aerospace, medicine, nuclear energy, even space exploration. The story of the Mark 14 became a metaphor for systemic failure, how truth can be buried beneath hierarchy, and how only persistence can uncover it. The ocean's final lesson. Today, if you visit Pearl Harbor's USS Bowfin Submarine Museum, you'll find two artifacts displayed side by side. One is a Mark 14 torpedo, polished, gleaming, a monument to both failure and perseverance. The other is a piece of mangled metal recovered from the wreck of a Japanese ship sunk by an American sub in 1944. The plaque beneath them reads, "From failure came precision. From precision came victory." Visitors often pause there, reading the names engraved on nearby memorial walls, the crews of submarines that never returned. And in that silence, surrounded by rusted steel and ocean breeze, it becomes clear, this story was never just about torpedoes. It was about truth under pressure and the price of learning too late. The Mark 14 didn't just change naval warfare. It changed how humans build, test, and believe. Epilogue: Beneath the waves. The ocean has no memory, yet it holds every secret. Somewhere, beneath thousands of feet of cold water, the last unexploded Mark 14 torpedoes still lie waiting. Their propellers frozen, their warheads quiet. They will never detonate. Their war is over. But for those who study the sea, for engineers, historians, sailors, and dreamers, those rusted weapons remain a message from the deep. Never trust perfection. Never stop testing. Never forget the price of silence. Because beneath the waves, every mistake is final. And the ocean, vast, eternal, and merciless, remembers everything we try to forget. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the ocean seemed calm again. Yet beneath that calm surface lay a truth forged in steel, salt water, and the sacrifices of thousands of men. The war beneath the waves had left scars far deeper than the seabed, scars carved into memory, into machines, into the very soul of naval warfare. The Mark 14 torpedo, once a symbol of American failure and denial, had transformed into one of the greatest redemption stories in military history. What began as a weapon of embarrassment became a lesson written in every sonar pulse that followed. Pride had sunk ships. Arrogance had cost lives. But through failure came progress, the kind that would shape the future of modern warfare forever. By 1946, the U.S. Navy's internal investigations revealed the grim truth no one had wanted to face. The torpedoes' depth controls were never tested properly. Engineers had calibrated them in freshwater tanks, unaware that salt water would change buoyancy. The magnetic exploders, designed to detonate beneath enemy hulls, malfunctioned near the equator because no one tested them in tropical waters. The contact detonators, supposed to trigger on impact, shattered instead. The official report concluded that the Mark 14's early failures were not due to sabotage or poor design, but to something far more dangerous: human arrogance. The Navy's own culture of hierarchy and silence had buried the warnings of men who knew something was wrong. The weapon failed because men refused to question it, the report said. Those words would echo through every naval training center for decades. From that painful truth, reform began. The Navy created new divisions for weapon testing, new standards for engineering oversight, and a new doctrine: never deploy an untested weapon. Every device, every detonator, every guidance system had to be proven in combat-like conditions before being trusted. And from that discipline emerged the next generation of torpedoes: the Mark 18, the first electric torpedo; the Mark 27, known as Cutie, designed to chase down enemy submarines; and later, the Mark 37, the first truly intelligent torpedo, guided by sound itself. The men who had once fought the system to fix the Mark 14 became the architects of modern naval precision. Their failures became the foundation for technologies that would one day guide missiles and drones. In the laboratories of Newport and San Diego, engineers tested everything. No assumption went unchallenged. No error went unrecorded. The ghosts of lost submarines, of wasted patrols, and of sailors who never came home haunted every design meeting. Failure was no longer shameful, it was essential. Across the Pacific, Japan was undergoing a transformation of its own. The Imperial Navy that once ruled the seas was gone, its proud ships resting on the ocean floor. The men who had commanded them faced silence, defeat, and reflection. Yet even amid the ruins, a new spirit was born. By 1954, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force emerged, no longer a fleet of conquest, but of protection. The lessons of the war had reshaped their identity. Their mission was no longer domination, but preservation of life, of peace, of the fragile balance that the ocean demanded. The irony was not lost on those who remembered the Pacific War. Two nations that had once hunted each other beneath the waves were now partners, their navies cooperating to safeguard the very waters they had once stained with blood and oil. American submariners trained Japanese crews. Japanese engineers studied American sonar. The cycle of destruction had given way to a cycle of understanding. The ocean had taken much, but in its vast, quiet expanse, it had also taught humility. As the Cold War dawned, the world descended into a new kind of tension. Nuclear submarines, capable of ending civilization, prowled silently beneath the polar ice. The stakes were higher than ever, yet the lessons of the Mark 14 still guided them. Every new weapon was tested, retested, questioned, and verified. Commanders passed down stories of the early torpedo failures to remind their crews that technology could not replace responsibility. Question everything, they said. The ocean forgives nothing. In classrooms at Annapolis and Pearl Harbor, young officers studied the Mark 14 saga not just as history, but as doctrine. The story was no longer about blame, it was about vigilance. The failures of the past had become the moral compass of the modern Navy. When the wrecks of the lost submarines were finally discovered decades later, Tang, Wahoo, Grayback, and others, their rusted hulls lay like silent memorials on the seafloor. Divers placed plaques and flags on their remains, whispering prayers into the void. Inside each of those wrecks were men who had trusted their weapons to work, who had given everything to a flawed system that later learned from their loss. The Navy honored them not as victims, but as teachers. At Pearl Harbor today, inside the Bowfin Submarine Museum, two artifacts rest side by side. One is a Mark 14 torpedo, its polished casing gleaming beneath display lights. The other is a twisted piece of metal from a Japanese ship it eventually sank, a symbol of what perseverance and correction had achieved. A small plaque between them bears a simple line: "From failure came precision. From precision came victory." Visitors stand quietly before it, watching the light glint off the steel, listening to the faint hum of the sea outside. For the sailors who descend beneath the waves today, in nuclear subs, in attack boats, in the silent guardians of the deep, the story of the Mark 14 is more than history. It's a warning carved in metal and memory. Every checklist, every test, every command spoken in the control room carries the weight of that legacy. The ocean still holds the wreckage of those who learned too late that faith without proof is fatal. The war beneath the waves ended 80 years ago, but its echoes endure. The sea still whispers of pride, courage, and loss. And somewhere down there, amid the silence of the deep, the ghosts of submariners keep watch, reminding every new generation that technology may advance, but the ocean never forgets. Because beneath the surface, there are no second chances. Every mistake is permanent. Every failure is written in steel. And the sea remembers everything humanity tries to forget.